Hey, hello.
Hey.
Hi.
How you doing?
You may have seen me on campus.
Maybe I sat next to you in class, or lived down the hall from you.
Or saw you at an event in the student union.
What you may not know about me is that I don't believe in God. I don't practice religion. I'm an atheist.
I'm an atheist.
I'm a secular atheist.
I am an agnostic atheist.
I'm an atheist.
I'm an atheist. I live my life with strong secular values. I believe in helping other people.
I believe in social justice and equality for everyone.
I plan to have one life.
And I want to make a positive impact on the world.
There are many people like me.
People like me.
People like me.
People like me.
Like me. Like me.
Like me in your school.
We are happy to have Camp Quest as a sponsor of the Secular Student Alliance Virtual Conference and as the presenter for this webinar. Camp Quest is a nonprofit within the secular movement and provides week-long residential, secular, co-ed summer camps across the United States for children aged 18 to 17. Please check out their website, campquest.org, to find out camps that are running this summer. You can also check out their volunteer opportunities if you're interested in volunteering to work camp.
The Secular Student Alliance is excited to announce our annual scholarship offerings. The application opens today and is available through August of 2021. You can learn more at secularstudents.org/scholarships.
Well, we want to welcome everyone and so glad to have John here with us. Just going to do a little quick housekeeping sort of things. John will have a presentation and afterwards we'll be doing some Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A tab and we'll get those answered. If you're joining us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, please feel free to put your questions in the comments. We have staff watching those and we'll get those questions to John so that we can get those answered as well. So very glad to have you here today, John. So just a little quick little introduction of John. So John is the former lead singer of the Christian pop rock band Hawk Nelson. So in May of 2020, John revealed that he no longer believed in God, and and he's going to tell you a little bit more about his journey in that and the loss of faith and beliefs as an agnostic, and how being part of something bigger than himself. So John, it's fantastic to have you here and I'm excited to hear your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. And I want to say good to see you, everyone. But I'm just going to assume, I know you can see me, but I can't really see you. I did put together a little talk for this, and most of my I now host a show called The Wonder and the Mystery of Being. It's on YouTube and it's on every sort of podcast outlet. And on that show, I have conversations with people about faith and doubt and questions and this process we sometimes call deconstruction, right? So I'm more used to having these sort of back and forth conversations. So for me, just talking for 30 or 40 minutes about my journey and about my experience and about wonder and mystery and awe, I wasn't sure how I was going to be able to do that. So what I did is I actually recorded a talk so that I could take a couple passes at it and make sure that I didn't waste your time. So I'm going to play that talk for you here. It's about 35 minutes or something like that. And then at the end of that talk, we're going to come back live. And then I would love, this is my favorite part of any of these things, is I would love to ask or interact with you, any questions you guys have about your own lives, about things that maybe you are wrestling with, the questions that you might have about faith, doubt, and everything in between. That's where I really come alive. So I'm going to play this pre-recorded talk for you, and then we'll come back and we'll chat. I hope you enjoy it.
Hey, John, you may need to check the audio on the video there.
Oh, problem. Okay, hold on. I can fix this. Perhaps this is something I should have tested beforehand, right?
It's, we're all used to it in this last year of Zoom. We're good.
All right, let's try this again. Tell me what happens when I do this.
What's up, everybody? Welcome
There
to
you go.
that I have pre-recorded in order to hopefully waste as little of your time as possible. I'm really grateful to be with you today and grateful to have this time together. And what I want to talk about today, well, the title of my talk is called Embracing the Wonder and the Mystery of Being. And I'm someone who grew up Christian, but I find myself in a place now where I don't call myself a Christian. And I have found that as I have left religious spaces and gone into, moved into a perspective that's much more secular, I've actually found that my sense of wonder and awe about the world around me has increased, not the other way around. And so I wanted to share today with you some of the ideas about that, that I've found really helpful. So to give you a little background on me before I get to that, I'm Canadian originally. I live in San Diego now with my wife and 2 kids. I have a son who's 4, a daughter who's 2. They keep me very busy. They're both as opinionated as I am. So as you can imagine, that's a handful. But to rewind the clock, I grew up in Canada, a couple of different small towns in Canada, and my dad's a pastor, and I grew up in a very white, evangelical, charismatic Christian environment. Worship music was really important in that environment, and so were many of these expressions of the Holy Spirit. It was a very, very charismatic, expressive environment. So there was an emphasis on a relationship with Jesus, often in a very emotionally charged way. There was lots of speaking in tongues, lots of roaring like lions, barking like dogs, all kinds of wild stuff. And we didn't quite get to the snake biting stuff you sometimes hear about. Not biting snakes, but, being able to withstand snake bites, that whole thing that, sort of seems like maybe one of the craziest expressions. Didn't quite get there, but we had a lot of really expressive stuff going on in my childhood in the churches I grew up in. And as I got more involved in church as I got older, I joined a worship team, and I got really interested in music. The first song I ever learned on guitar was a song called Show Your Power. Maybe some of you that grew up in the Vineyard or churches like that, if you're familiar with that stream of Christianity at all, maybe you know that song. And that was my upbringing. I got really into music, and eventually I joined a number of different bands, and that culminated in me joining this band called Hawk Nelson. Now, this was in the early 2000s, and there was something going on in the early 2000s where there was just this burst of Christian music. There was a sort of just explosion of bands doing Christian music, and we really participated in that. I tend to think that part of the reason for that was that in Christian culture at the time, and maybe some of you experienced this, there was this sense of wanting to have a Christian version of everything, right? Like, we don't want to listen to secular music, we want to listen to Christian music. And so for a lot of parents who were concerned about the music their children were listening to, if they were into something like Blink-182, instead of that, they could have a Hawk Nelson CD. If they were into Good Charlotte, instead of that, they could have a Reliant K CD. And so that was sort of the environment that we came up in. And quite honestly, our careers benefited from that cultural reality. So, we hopped in a van, we started playing 250 shows a year. We were basically living out of this van for a few years. I didn't really have an address for a while, and we loved it. It was such an adventure. I was the guitar player at the time. So for the first 8 years of the band, I was the guitar player. And then in 2012, our singer left the band, and the idea came up that maybe I should be the new singer. Now, I wasn't sure about this idea. I wasn't in a place where I felt like I was, confident enough to be the lead singer of a band. Like, that seemed really intimidating. But I took it as a challenge to learn a new skill, and I studied other frontmen and other singers. And I learned the skill of fronting a band. And I also, in that season, I became the main songwriter for the band. And so when you're a songwriter for a band, people that don't know much about the music industry might not know this, but if you hear an album from a band that you like, and say the album has 10 songs on it, there's a pretty good chance that they wrote more than 10 songs for that album. They may have written 20, they may have written 30, they may have written 100. A tremendous amount of effort goes into these albums, and so it's really important that they're the best songs possible. So I was writing probably 60 songs for every album, maybe more, 60, 70 songs per album, and we did 3 albums with me as the singer. And so that's, a few hundred songs. And we were working with this, material where, it was sort of expected that as a Christian band, we were going to have something meaningful to say about our faith, about life through a Christian perspective, those kinds of things. And so I was constantly looking for inspiration. And so I started diving into Christianity and the history of Christianity and what exactly do we believe, because I felt a responsibility to write music that was sort of theologically sound. And in that process, I somewhat realized that I actually didn't know a ton about the history of Christianity. I didn't know a ton about Christian theology. I mean, I knew the basics, the important stuff, right? But my experience with Christianity had been much more emotionally charged, like with all these expressions that I sort of talked about earlier, like an emphasis on emotions and experiences and worship and things like that. And so as I dove into, the history of Christianity and dove into Christian theology, I started realizing that there are a lot of different views about a lot of things, and not just the sort of secondary issues, but some of the primary issues too. Like there is a huge diversity of thought within Christianity. And that didn't on its face make me feel like Christianity was untrue. It just gave me pause, because I was like, I sort of thought that these things were true and set in stone and, unquestionable and just obviously true. And yet on some really basic doctrines, like, we don't all agree. And that really sort of startled me and got me thinking about, like, okay, well, why do I believe what I believe? And am I a Christian because I really believe it? Or am I a Christian because it was what I was raised in and it's just my normal? And that brought me to another question of, like, okay, if it's the second one, then if I had been born in a place like Iran, would I be a Muslim? And when I really contemplated that question, I found myself saying, probably yes. Now, that opened up all sorts of thoughts for me. It made me realize that I was largely a Christian because of who I was born to and when and where. And none of those are things in my control. So it really made me wonder about Christianity, about why people believe the things that they believe. So that brought me to a place where I started sort of being open to other ideas. And I'm like, I wonder if I would believe this if I grew up over here, or I wonder if I would believe something different if I was born 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years from now. I just began to wonder. And in that period of wondering, I started to notice some cultural things that I sort of felt weird about. One good example is the Supreme Court passed a law allowing same-sex marriage in the United States. And I immediately had this gut feeling like that was something worth celebrating, right? Extending the right of marriage to sort of a marginalized group like the LGBTQ plus community that just felt like progress to me. Like that felt like something worth celebrating. And I had never really thought about it that deeply because, you know, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual dude that knew a few, I had a few gay friends, but not super close to me. And so it just wasn't an issue that I felt super connected to, but here I was resonating really deeply and feeling like it was important to celebrate the Supreme Court decision. And I knew that I actually couldn't celebrate it publicly because I was a member of a Christian band. And that was not something that my tribe, I guess, like the cultural sort of stuff going on in Christianity, the culture within Christianity that I was a part of, it just didn't agree with same-sex marriage, didn't affirm, you know, homosexuality or transsexuality, transgender, any of that. And so I found my gut at odds with the culture I was a part of, and that gave me pause again. A few years later, I had gotten into some film work as sort of like a side hustle. And one of the projects I worked on was a documentary in Uganda. And I was documenting this people group called the Batwa. Now, this people group, for a number of reasons that I don't have time to get into, they are experiencing a tremendous amount of suffering, serious discrimination, and just really horrible circumstances. Just to give you one data point to let you know sort of the impact it was having on me, only half of the Batwa children that are born make it to the age of 5 for various reasons. And to see that level of child mortality and to see the conditions that these children were living in, it really impacted me. Because at that time, I had actually also just become a father myself. And in the eyes of every child that was suffering in these parts of remote Uganda, I saw the eyes of my own kids. And I again was confronted with the question, if my kids were born here instead of in San Diego, their lives would look like this instead of the lives they have here in San Diego. And so I just couldn't shake this feeling that like the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving God was incompatible with the suffering that I was seeing. Because for me as a father, you know, if I saw my children suffering in the way that I saw these children suffering, I would break every rule to come to their defense, to come to their aid. And I saw no evidence of that happening here. I mean, yes, there were these missionaries I was documenting that are there helping these children, but they're still living in incredibly horrible situations. And I just couldn't shake this feeling that the God I had always believed in, the God that intervened on behalf of his children, it didn't make sense to believe in that God after I saw what I saw. And that was a big turning point for me. And that created space for me to dive even deeper into my questions. So I began studying other religions. I began studying where we got our ideas of heaven and hell. I began studying evolution and astronomy and, you know, like ideas of where the universe might have come from. And I was confronted with so many facts that seemed to run contrary to the faith that I had always had. And I remember reaching a point where I finally had to look myself in the mirror and say, I don't think I believe in God. And that was not a welcome thought. That was a terrifying thought. I felt very vulnerable and unsafe after that thought because I had always believed that God would be there looking out for me, that God had his hand of favor on my life. And here I was confronted with the idea that why would God have his hand of favor on my life and not the lives of these children in Uganda? Is it because I deserved it more than they did? That answer seemed problematic. Is it because God just randomly chose to bless me and not them? That answer seems problematic too. And so I began to dive deeper into my doubts, deeper into my questions, and I found all sorts of ideas that challenged my faith. The big ones for me were the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, the treatment of the LGBTQ plus community by the Christian culture that I had been a part of, the ideas like original sin and eternal conscious torment, which also didn't, like that version of hell didn't make any sense to me if we're talking about an all-powerful and all-loving God. And there was so much more that I can't get into, but suffice it to say, I found myself in a place where I could no longer hold belief in the God that I once had. See, I have a personality that tends to be a little woo-woo. I mean, I do love science and I love studying, real tangible facts and things, but I also have this sort of I like the mystical side of life. And so I was a little bit hesitant to adopt a perspective of the world and the universe that was strictly sort of like cold, hard facts and knowledge and reason and logic. And all there is matter. I wanted there to be something more. And so that got me thinking about wonder and mystery. And this is just a side note. I stumbled upon a field of study called phenomenology that's somewhere in between philosophy and psychology. And it was the study of phenomenology that really got me in touch with these ideas of wonder and mystery. So I don't have time to get into exactly what phenomenology is, but Google it, read about Martin Heidegger. He has a book called Being and Time that really changed a lot of things for me. But I would also maybe recommend you read about being and time and not read Being and Time, because it's a little hard to get your head around. It certainly was for me. Anyways, suffice it to say, I land on wonder and mystery. So why are these things so important to me? So I wrote 2 sentences about wonder and mystery that I think sum up why I think they're so important in my way that I see the world. So here's those 2 sentences. Wonder invites us to marvel at what is. Mystery invites us to explore what might be. I want to read that again. Wonder invites us to marvel at what is. Mystery invites us to explore what might be. See, when I started thinking about how the universe really is and what it really is to be a human, what that experience is really like, it started to feel like letting go of my religious beliefs actually opened me up to more wonder and awe about existence, not less. Because in the religious spaces I had always grown up in, it seemed like there was always an answer for everything. How did humanity come to be? Well, turn to Genesis, it'll tell you. How did the universe come to be? Again, turn to Genesis, it'll tell you. How should we live? Well, look at the 10 Commandments, they'll tell you. How should we behave in the world? Well, look at the Gospels, Jesus will tell you. And there was always this answer to everything that was pointing back to the Bible or pointing back to Christian ideas. And I started to notice in a lot of scientific pursuits, the whole reason we were doing science in the first place is because we had unanswered questions. And there are people who were not satisfied with the more mystical or mythical or religious answers to some of the questions we had. We wanted to know in a little bit more of a substantive way answers to the questions that we had. So here's some things that I learned that filled me with wonder. I learned that the universe is not 6,000 years old. It is 13.4 billion years old, which is a massive number that we have a really hard time contemplating. I learned that the universe has been expanding for 13.4 billion years. And if we were to rewind the clock, we would see that it goes all the way back to apparently a single point. And at that point, things get really, really weird, because not only is space involved in this expansion, but it also seems that time is as well. So time seems to have began at the point of that Big Bang. Now, lots of Christians have latched onto that as proof that the universe has a beginning, but we don't know what existed before that Big Bang. The word before doesn't even make sense, because like I just said, time is wrapped up in this whole thing too. We don't know if our universe just sort of burst into existence. We don't know if it existed before in some way. Again, before doesn't even make sense. We don't know if there are universes sort of bursting in and out of existence all the time. There's so much there we don't know. And that mystery is unexplored territory. And it invites us to wonder, to engage with what might be. And that is exciting to think about. I also learned that human beings weren't created on a specific day, and women weren't created out of a rib from Adam, right? We as human beings arrived at the place we're at now through a process of evolution. It's natural selection and genetic mutation that caused us to gradually evolve into the creatures that we are today. And that means that we are animals. We are highly evolved animals. Now, I had sort of grown up believing that humans, animals, and plants are three separate categories. And I was astounded to learn that not only do we have common ancestors with apes and primates, so if you go back about 6 million years or so, apes and other primates and us all sort of diverged somewhere around that time. And if you go back earlier than that, then we have common ancestors. In fact, if you keep going, we have common ancestors with everything that ever lived, including plants. I did not know that. And that was amazing for me to discover. In fact, when you think about what we've learned about genetics, and we've only learned about DNA and genetics in the last 30, 40, 50 years, right? And this is new information for us. But it was crazy for me to learn about the genetic similarities between us as human beings and everything that lives. So let me give you a couple numbers that sort of blew my mind. If you were to compare your DNA to the DNA of any other human being, you would be 99.9% genetically identical to them. Absolutely anybody that you could find living today as a human being, you are 99.9% genetically identical to them. That is crazy to me. The things that make you you genetically and differentiate you from every other human being are contained in that 0.1% of genetic material. That is wild. We have so much more in common than we do in difference. And the similarities don't stop there. We are something like 96% genetically identical to chimpanzees. Everything that makes us human and not chimp is contained in 4% of our genetic material. That is insane. And it gets crazier. We're 90% genetically identical to cats. We're 80% genetically identical to cows. We're something like 60% genetically identical to fruit flies. And we share about half, now I've heard different numbers on this, but it's somewhere around half our genetic material with bananas. I love that. And the reason for that is that all life on Earth, if you trace it back far enough, we share common descent. And if you trace that descent back far enough, it goes back to some sort of single-celled organisms early in the development of life on Earth. Now, we still don't know how those early single-celled organisms came to be. We don't know how this process of evolution got kickstarted. But I would say again, that is a mystery that invites us to continue to explore it and to resist the urge to create an artificial sense of certainty or to tell stories that we believe in instead of continuing to investigate the truth of what might be. Okay, so for me, discovering that human beings are just highly evolved animals, it sort of broke down this category barrier between humans and animals. And it made me realize that if I care about the suffering of human beings, then why wouldn't I care about the suffering of animals? And it really caused me to think differently about animal suffering. And it caused me to think like, well, I've had pets that I deeply cared about, and their suffering is real when they suffer. And you know, the animals that we eat for food, like if they're living an existence that involves tremendous suffering, like it just opened me up to have, you know, these ideas just opened me up to have empathy for those creatures as well. And so I actually, in this process, became a vegetarian. So I don't eat meat anymore because I feel compelled to minimize the amount of suffering that animals experience because of my habits and the way that I live. That's a personal decision for me, but it's one that I feel a great conviction about. And then I started to take that idea further. And I started to think, well, if I care about the suffering of other people and I care about the suffering of animals, maybe I should also care about plants in some way. Now, obviously, you have to consume something to live. So it's not really an option to like not ever eat anything because you might make it suffer. Like you have to eat something. But maybe we should think about how we care for the earth in the same way that we have empathy for other people and for humans. Maybe there's a way of living that's more comprehensively caring and empathetic and thoughtful. And in the middle of thinking about that, I stumbled on this idea that comes out of yoga. It's one of the 5 yamas, and the yamas are one of 8 limbs of yoga. So this is sort of coming out of the Hindu tradition. And this idea is called ahimsa. And it really revolutionized the way I think about the way I live my life. And ahimsa is basically this idea of a doctrine of non-harm. So the most basic expressions of ahimsa are basically like, don't do things that hurt other people. And that's pretty basic, right? Because that's not that far off from the golden rule, which is basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is definitely an idea that's embedded in Christian thought, but it's actually also been embedded in almost every religious practice that's ever been on earth. It's an incredibly common and almost ubiquitous idea that we should treat other people the way that we want to be treated. So that's part of the doctrine of ahimsa, but ahimsa is more than that. It's this idea that we should walk through life doing as little damage to anything living as possible. And like, I imagine that as like, even when I walk through a meadow, like how few blades of grass can I stomp on? And I know that sounds very hippie woo woo, but if you just think about operating in life that way, like how light a touch can I have? How light a step can I have? How much can I leave this place that I live in better than I found it? How little damage can I do as I live my life? And I just think that's a really beautiful guiding thought, guiding principle. And I never would have found that expression of that idea if I hadn't explored other religious practices. And that's something that as a person who is completely non-religious now, I've actually found a lot of beauty in studying other religions and other traditions. Sure, there's tons of stuff in almost any religion that I've found to not necessarily be things that I wanted to implement in my life, but there's always been something I can learn. And so I've really experienced this sense of wonder in studying the religious practices and sort of cultural practices of cultures other than my own. And I had found that in my own life as a Christian, I was very closed to those ideas because they were foreign, or they were bad, or they were inherently wrong because they weren't Christian. And so for me, letting go of the religious sort of exclusivity of Christianity allowed me to look for good ideas and goodness anywhere in life that I could find it. And right there, we sort of have a problem, because one of the things I've been confronted with since departing Christianity is, by what standards do you determine what is good? Now, Christians will often say that if you're a completely non-religious person, if you don't believe in God, then you have no basis for morality. And I just completely reject that. I would recommend the book, The Expanding Circle by Dr. Peter Singer, that talks about the evolutionary origins of morality. I also would read the book, The Social Leap by William von Hippel, that talks about how the social aspects of our existence and as we evolved really influenced the way that we see the world and the way that we are as human beings. So I don't have time to do a deep dive into morality here right now, but suffice it to say, I think all you need for morality is evolution and social dynamics. And I would recommend those 2 books if you want to learn more about that. But the very short version is, we have moral intuitions because it is in our benefit to have them. There was an evolutionary benefit to having moral intuitions. And so, of course, we have them. Evolution tends to favor traits that have evolutionary benefits, and morality is one of those traits. So while I don't believe that there is a God guiding our moral intuitions, I do believe there is a kind of force guiding our moral intuitions, and that has been the force of evolution. You see, morality is one of the issues on which many religious circles, particularly evangelical Christianity, believe that the world is getting worse. In fact, there is this pervasive sense in Christianity, at least the version I grew up in, that the world is dangerous and it's getting more dangerous and worse all the time. And in my sort of deconstruction process, where I was sort of taking apart my beliefs and taking a fresh look at them and wondering whether I still believed them, I discovered a lot of information to the contrary. I discovered a lot to hope in. I discovered that actually for human beings, the world is getting to be a better place all the time. Here's some stats that sort of blew my mind, right? In the year 1900, the average lifespan of a human being, the global average, was 31. If you were born in 1900, you could expect to, on average, live to the age of 31. Now, that number is 72. In developed countries, it's well into the 80s. This is huge progress. That's something to celebrate. We see the same thing when we're talking about poverty. 200 years ago, 90% of the global population lived in extreme poverty. In the 80s, that number was down to 35%. And today, that number is down below 10%. That is insane progress. In the year 1900, the global literacy rate was somewhere around 20%. Now it's above 80%. We see the same types of gains in almost every area of human experience. And that is just absolutely remarkable. Now, we don't hear these stories because we are so tuned in to thinking negatively about things. We're tuned in to thinking about how scary the world is. The news perpetuates these ideas. And the eschatology and end times view of the future that is contained in a lot of religious circles, especially the evangelical Christianity that I'm familiar with, it feeds this idea that the world is getting worse. Now, one thing I want to make super clear is that we still have a lot of work to do. And we should do that work. We should not take our foot off the gas. We should not say, oh, things are getting better, we can just coast from here. No, we still have so much work to do when it comes to inequality, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to human rights. We have tons of work to do. But my point here is that we do not have to look at the world as a place where things are getting worse. We can choose to look at the data and believe that the world and the human experience is getting better all the time. If you want to learn more about that stuff, I recommend a book called Enlightenment Now by Dr. Steven Pinker. It was really helpful for me in understanding this perspective a little bit more. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the idea of an afterlife. Pretty much every religion has some version of an idea of an afterlife, of what happens after death. And I feel like that gives us a clue as to why these religions came to be in the first place. The idea that we might not exist after death is a terrifying one. We've been terrified by death since we discovered the idea of the future, since we became conscious and aware enough to cast our vision into the future and wonder what might be coming, and realize that everyone around us we see eventually dies and that we'll die too. That is a terrifying realization. And if you're someone who comes from a religious space, it can be very, very terrifying to think about your own mortality in this way and the mortality of people that you care about. It can be terrifying to think that this life is all we have. But the truth is, this life is the only thing that we have for sure. Today is the only thing we have for sure. And that idea initially felt really terrifying for me. But again, wonder, mystery, what do they tell me about my own mortality? And I came to realize that anything that we have an infinite amount of isn't actually that valuable. We value things like diamonds and precious jewels because they're rare. If you could find a diamond anywhere, no one would care about diamonds, right? We value things because they're rare. And there's nothing more rare than our experience as a human being. There's nothing more rare and precious and finite than our time here, being a human, knowing other humans, being in relationship with other humans, being in relationship with this earth, with this universe, experiencing the wonder and the mystery of being. That is rare. When I realized that, I started to hug my kids a little tighter. I started to cherish the moments I have with the people I care about more than I used to, because I realized that this moment we have right now, this is all we have for sure. And that made me feel like it was just so much more beautiful and precious. It made me feel a sense of urgency too, because I can't rely on the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving God to correct any of the things in life that I see as problematic. It's our job. It's our job to correct them. And I can't rely on the idea that they might be corrected in some future life. We have to tackle them now. So if there are things that we see in the world that are harmful, and if we see people that are being oppressed, if we are witness to the suffering of other human beings or our own suffering, it's our responsibility as human beings to come together and do something about it. So if I could leave you with any sort of final thought here, I would want to go back to the idea that wonder invites us to marvel at what is. There is so much about the experience of being human that's amazing and wonderful and beautiful. And mystery invites us to explore what might be. And what might be, that does mean what might be in the future, but it also means what might be here and now that we just don't see or understand. So we should dive into both of those things. We should dive into understanding existence better. We should ask hard questions. We should tackle hard problems. And we should do all of this embracing these ideas of wonder and awe about the human experience. We can do these things as a human race, but we can also do these things personally and individually. And I want to leave you with a paragraph from a book written by an author who actually is also a speaker at this event this weekend. And that author is SSAcon. She's the daughter of Carl Sagan. And she wrote a book called For Small Creatures Such as We. And it's about rituals and meaning in a secular perspective. And it's one of the best books I could possibly recommend to anyone who's coming out of religious spaces, who are looking for ways to create meaning in their lives. And so I want to leave you with this paragraph that was really meaningful to me. And it's the last paragraph of her book. It says, "No matter what the universe has in store, it cannot take away from the fact that you were born. You'll have some joy and some pain, and all the other experiences that make up what it's like to be a tiny part of a grand cosmos. No matter what happens next, you were here. And even when any record of our individual lives is lost to the ages, that won't detract from the fact that we were. We lived. We were part of the enormity. All the great and terrible parts of being alive, the shocking, sublime beauty and heartbreak, the monotony, the interior thoughts, the shared pain and pleasure. It really happened. All of it. On this little world that orbits a yellow star out in the great vastness. And that alone is cause for celebration." I love that. Thank you guys for spending this time with me. And I hope you left this conversation with just a little bit more awe and wonder about the world and this experience that we all share of being human.
Hey. All right. Well, all right.
That was great, John. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad I pre-recorded that because I was like, hey, what am I about to say here? Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for having me here. And I'm already seeing some questions pop up, and there's some good ones. So I'm happy to jump right in.
Well, no, yeah, great. Yeah, we've had a good number of questions. We'll start with some as they came in, and we'll just sort of pop around a little bit.
Sure.
I would have just one of the messages that we always sort of talk with our students about is like your sense. You have the sense of mystery. For us, it's curiosity. So curiosity and compassion, curiosity and compassion.
I love that. Actually, so I'm sitting in a 1969 Airstream. This is my office, and I named it the Curiosity. It has a little sign on the side that says the Curiosity. So I'm with you on the curiosity thing.
Definitely, definitely. So Mehdi wanted to know, I think as part of your journey, how did your wife react to your change in your, becoming non-religious? And, do you have any sort of sense of spirituality now?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really interesting. So my wife was about a year behind me in this process. She definitely is like fully with me now, but there was a period of time there where she was a little bit intimidated by the process for me. Like, and it just seemed like the idea of doubting these really fundamental things that we both grew up in. She and I are both pastors' kids. So like we were like really like drenched in Christianity growing up. And so I think for her, when I was going through this process, it was a little bit of like, she was a little bit excited to think about the idea that we might not be beholden to some of the parts of Christianity that we had gut feelings against, like maybe we can accept people as they are a little bit more, like maybe we don't have to feel like constantly guilty for not enjoying church, those kinds of things. So she was a little bit enticed by those things, but she also was a little bit scared to dive in. And then about 8 months after I sort of really got my process of evaluating these things going, she read a book called Pure by Linda K. Klein that sort of tackles the purity culture issue. And then she read a book called You Are Your Own by Jamie Lee Finch. And I recommend both of those books super highly. And those books really catapulted her into a space where she was like, oh my gosh, like I totally don't believe this stuff anymore either. So her process looked a little different than mine. And that's one of the things that's really been interesting for me the last year is that everyone's process here is different. So there might be elements of my story for those of you watching, there might be elements of my story that sound familiar, and there might be some that are completely different for you. And then as far as the spirituality thing, I mentioned it briefly in the talk, but like I studied this field called phenomenology, which is basically, it's the study of human subjective experience. And realizing how subjective our experiences are as human beings really opened me up to the possibility that everything that people, say that they experience, especially in religious circles, like I can actually affirm that, yes, I believe you did have those experiences, right? Like those experiences were real for you. That's a different thing than saying, like what you believe about the universe, as a result of those experiences. That's a different question. But I can approach anyone from any religious perspective and go like, hey, like I believe you experience these things and I'm not out to invalidate your experience, So that was a helpful thing for me. I don't necessarily have spiritual practices in a sort of Christian or spiritually like metaphysical way, but I do meditate because I think that's really, really beneficial. I have a lot of practices that might be described as more psychological, I guess. Yeah.
And you sort of mentioned the phenomenology. Chevy asked, how do you personally define that? And he says, I assume you mean in the philosophical sense.
Yeah.
So if so, sort of whose writing sort of turned you on and how to better understand it?
Yeah, I mean, I know. So Martin Heidegger is a really fundamental voice in phenomenology. He's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. One of the most helpful talks I found was, and I know he's a super controversial figure, and he's said some stuff on transgender issues that I just absolutely disagree with. But Jordan Peterson has a lot of lectures from his psychology classes from like 2015 to 2017 on YouTube. And again, while I cannot agree with everything that he has ever said, and aggressively disagree with a few things that he said, his talk on phenomenology and Martin Heidegger was really helpful in understanding the idea of phenomenology. So I would recommend that talk specifically. Again, not everything that he says.
Yeah, we'll agree with you on that part as well.
Yeah. I think a lot of people agree with me on that at this point. Yeah.
So yeah, and there were a couple of questions sort of related, sort of coming from, and you were sort of in a hyper religious, I think, with your background and
Yeah.
then the band being in that. I mean, it was really sort of a hyper sense of Christian. Was your life.
Yeah, yeah. And it was also like, and this is probably true for a lot of you watching, like a lot of Christian circles, the part of what adheres the group is an us versus them dynamic. So it's like we have our group. You can't trust anybody outside of it. You can't trust any things that you hear from media outside of it. You can't trust things that you hear from anyone that acts like an authority outside of it, because we have the truth and they have the world's lies, like that kind of thing. And so anyone who's in that kind of an environment, yeah, your spiritual community or your faith community is everything. And when you start to question that, it can be really, really challenging for family relationships, for social relationships. Yeah, and that was definitely the experience for me. But honestly, what's funny is like one of the things that challenged that idea for me was when I went to a public high school and I found a lot of people there that were really kind and wonderful to me. Because I had always had this sense that like, okay, well, as human beings, we're bad, like original sin, right? And like, we're bad, we're sinful. And if there's anything good inside of us, like that's God, that's Jesus. And so if you're taught that, you sort of come to expect that like, well, people that don't have Jesus, they don't have the good part. And that means that they're bad people. I mean, no one explicitly told me that, but like, you kind of get that sense growing up in some of these circles. And so it was the goodness of secular individuals or people that weren't Christian that really began to sort of cause me to question that way of seeing things. And so that was interesting for me.
So since you sort of brought up a little bit of that, Ruth asked you, in your version of Christian upbringing, was the biblical Jesus's statement that the saved should abandon their families ever addressed? So like his blaming the fig tree for not having...
I'm familiar. Yeah. So yeah, I think I saw that question. There's a couple of things there. I think one of the things that Ruth is probably talking about is the verse that talks about, if you cannot follow me unless you have to hate your mother and father, like that kind of a thing. I mean, it was kind of addressed. Like there was a lot of things in the Bible, in the Gospels and in the Bible as a whole, that explanations were given for, right? So it's like the explanation for that one would have been that like, oh, Jesus didn't actually mean you have to hate your mother and father. What he meant is that you should value your relationship with God more than any family relationships, right? And I accepted that. But, there was other explanations too, like, I'm trying to think, there were some other ones. Like there was oh yeah, I know the other one I was going to bring up is that when Jesus talks about like, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. The religious, the Christian, narrative that I would have been exposed to on those is similar. It's like, well, he didn't mean that literally. He just meant that like, don't be led into sin. But like, now I stand back and I go like, well, wait, like, why do we get to say based on our own opinions what Jesus meant literally and what he meant figuratively? It's like, it's like I could see it at that time. Like maybe that was a really intense teaching he was giving and maybe he meant it literally. Like, I don't know. So yeah, I do find that there's always, for these uncomfortable verses, there tends to be an explanation. One of the big ones that was important to me, and not to take too much time on this point, was there are two verses that explicitly say that women can't teach in church. So they're in 2 Timothy and 1st or 2nd Corinthians. I'm terrible at references. But it's these two very specific verses where Paul is writing and saying, women shouldn't teach. If they have questions about any theology or anything like that, they should ask their husbands at home, right? And again, the evangelical circles I grew up in, the Christian circles I grew up in actually tended to allow women to be in leadership more than most churches. But they always had these creative explanations for those ones. Like, oh, well, there was a cult in the city at the time led by women that they were talking about that specific issue. They weren't talking about women as a whole. And I'm like, no, they're talking about women as a whole. Come on. And I always wish that Christians would take that same flexibility and apply it to the passages that seem to be critical of homosexuality. And maybe we could have a little bit less homophobia in Christianity. But anyway, I'm on a rant now.
No, it's good. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I think I'll use the atheist community rather than sort of the non-religious. I think
Sure.
the cherry picking of which Bible verses you're going to decide to take literally or figuratively, or you get to ignore it drives the community crazy.
Yeah. And to be fair, like I have Christian friends, admittedly probably on the more progressive Christian side, that are driven crazy by some of those same things. So yeah.
Totally makes sense. And within my family, my aunt still believes, to this day, that men have one less rib than women because God took the rib from Adam from Adam to create Eve. I was like, you can just count, like just go down, you can count, it's the same. But that's because that's what the Bible says. We had a couple questions and I think coming from your background of people, and I don't think this is your intent of what you're doing and those sorts of things, but there are a couple questions like, what can non-religious people do, or what avenue is there for non-religious people in conversation with religious people to help them spark that sense of wonder or investigation, or like maybe there's something else and we can have that conversation. Like, is there, and you maybe from your own perspective, what is that sort of thing? Like, there is doubt in your religion. Like, it's okay to express that. And
some of the things, honestly, just learning about Christianity helped me a lot. So learning that basically there is no Christian doctrine that's always been universally agreed upon. Even the idea of like Jesus died for your sins, that idea is, it's in theology, is technically called penal substitutionary atonement theory, which is a long technical way of saying like, you deserve to die, Jesus took your place, but that idea is like, I grew up believing that was like the fundamental core idea in Christianity, but even that idea is actually not universally agreed upon. Even within Christianity, there's ideas such as like Christus Victor, which is an alternative to atonement theory, which is basically that like Jesus didn't die to save you from your sins. Jesus died to conquer death. So the only reason I bring that up is to say that within Christianity, there's a multiplicity of views on almost everything. And so if you can like learn about that stuff, then sometimes you can engage with your Christian friends and go like, hey, well, like, what do you think about this idea? And like, at least for me, realizing that Christianity wasn't this monolithic thing that absolutely everybody within Christianity agrees on. It opened up a lot of conversations for people that maybe they're not ready to have the core beliefs of the most important parts of Christianity to them challenged, but maybe there's some things that you could sort of nudge them on. One of the things I nudge my Christian friends on all the time is the passages that deal with homosexuality. And I think that there's a really strong case to be made, even if you are a Bible believing Christian, to affirm the LGBTQ plus community. I actually think that can be done. Now, I would rather that we sort of like give up biblical inerrancy altogether, but I recommend this book called The Gospel of Inclusion by my friend Brandon Robertson. And Brandon is a Christian. He's a gay, he's an out gay Christian. He's, again, more of the progressive side. But learning his perspective on some of those verses in the Bible that seem to be critical of homosexuality, that helped give me some tools to talk to my Christian friends about homosexuality in the hopes that they'll become more affirming, because that's a really practical thing. Like, even if they remain Christian, I would love for my Christian friends to be more affirming. And sometimes in that process, when you dislodge one thing, it'll get them thinking about other things. So that's one thing I think. And then I also, just to zoom out, I try not to have debates and arguments with people, and I try to lead with relationship, because for me, like seeing like getting to know really wonderful gay and trans folks, that was a tremendous motivator for me to learn more about, well, initially what the Bible says about homosexuality. And then that was just one sort of piece of the puzzle. So relationships, I think, trump debates. And so I would always encourage you to, operate in kindness as much as you can.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Part, I know we would say, you're never gonna convince someone over Twitter to change.
No.
So, but I think it is what I think that one of the core foundations of religious communities is community.
Yeah.
And the sense that there's this automatic assumption that if you're sick, people are going to come and take care of you. If you need, people come, you automatically have those bonds because of that in group. And that's one thing that I think within the secular organizations, and especially with the experience of our students on campuses when they have a chapter, they are forming their own little community. And it becomes in some instances, their safe place, and becomes, it's like, finally, there are people like me and those sorts of things. And so leaving a religious community and coming into a new one is a relief for lots of people.
Yeah. And I'm glad you addressed that, because I think community is actually one of the greatest challenges faced by people who depart religious circles over and over and over online. I mean, like the last year I've spent talking with people who say, like, I'm doubting my faith, or I'm coming out of my faith, but I don't know, like all of my friends and family are Christian. And so I don't have these people to connect to. And so, during the pandemic, actually the online space has sort of come to life with these people telling their stories and connecting with each other. And that's been really meaningful to me I mean, I have like dear friends now that I've actually never met in person. But what you're doing, and like what the Secular Student Alliance is doing is really helpful in that area, because it's like, hey, this is a community of people who have some shared experiences and shared perspectives, and we can gather around something other than a religious tradition. And so I think that's helpful.
Yeah. And I think, like, you mentioned Sasha, she's like, start building your own traditions. What we have these rituals, and start building your own traditions and those sorts of things. And those are important milestones and celebrations that we all have as human beings. Yeah. And I hope you all got to catch Sasha's appearance on this weekend, because I'm a huge fan of her. Yeah. One of the things that in your conversation that sort of struck me a little bit is we often have the conversation with our students, they're like, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And sometimes it'll just stop there and we're like, great, that tells me very little about you. Yeah. Now tell me what you're passionate about. Now tell me what you want to do. Now tell me how you want to change the world. Now, how are you going to make it better for you and for other people? Like, what is you're here for a short time. What's going to be your positive impact on the world? Yeah. So I love that you're I think part of what your journey is trying to figure that out. Yeah. Not only for yourself, but then, like, how do we do this as a people? Yeah. I mean, how do we do it individually, and how do we do it culturally, and as at the level of a society as well? And like, those are not easy questions, right? But like, I'm pretty drawn to secular humanism. For me, it's like, so I have a friend, Michael Gungor. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. I mean, I'm not like super close with him, but he's a musician too. And he started this podcast called The Liturgists. And now I think he technically calls himself a Christian now, although it's like, I'm not entirely sure exactly how that works for him, but he's sort of exploring what would it look like to have a healthy Christianity. And my answer to that is like, well, I actually think there are a lot of, like, Christianity has actually a lot of helpful and beautiful ideas embedded in it. And I would love to see as many of those ideas be retained. And certainly Christianity helped give us the sort of culture we have in the West today. I would love to retain as many of those healthy, good things as possible, and sort of jettison some of the baggage, but I'm just not convinced it would be called Christianity once that's done. And so that's why I think
I think secular humanism is the closest thing to that I've ever seen. And so I'm probably most aligned with that sort of movement.
Yeah, and I think some of the values we often look at, and you sort of, I've mentioned sort of homosexuality and trans issues, which are clearly addressed in the Bible. For many of our students, and about 50% of our students are women in leadership positions and those sorts of things. And so they often look at the relationship between religion and misogyny. And that's why I think over the last year and a half of religion and racial injustice. So you topple that with then, the issues of homosexuality and LGBT rights. And for our students, especially environmentalism and the climate change is hugely important. And just how dogmatic religion is on, and just being stubborn, and God gave us this earth and it is ours, and so all of those challenges.
Yeah, I literally that one has me absolutely flummoxed, because I'm just like, okay, so why? I actually don't understand why so many conservative Christians are basically like climate change deniers. I can't wrap my head around it, and I think it has something to do with politics, but for me, I'm just like, if you believe that like the earth is a gift from God to human beings, then actually the concept of stewarding it well should be a thing. So I have a hard time. I almost feel like Christianity should be on the forefront of environmentalism, and it seems to sometimes be doing the opposite, and that's strange to me.
Yeah, and we often think, I think within this, we've had conversations with the Secular Student Alliance, and really think that a lot of that comes into a bit of the science denial. So
I think that's true. So a sense of suspicion towards science, a sense of suspicion towards government. I mean, I think a lot of that comes back to the in versus out, the us versus them thing that we talked about. And then there's also a thread of this end times eschatology, this sort of belief that, everything is going to get bad and then Jesus is going to come back. Like that belief, that narrative that everything's getting worse and worse and worse, and we're going to see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and all that stuff, and the mark of the beast, and people believing that the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, is the mark of the beast, and stuff like that. It's just it's wild.
Yeah, and when you leave, you go to heaven, and it's all better anyway. So
yeah, and that's a really important point, actually, because I have found that I don't know what happens after death. I think there's a really good chance that just as I don't remember being before I was born, I may not experience being after I die, I'm going to go with that as a default. If I get anything else, maybe it'll be bonus. I don't know. But yeah, I think for a time that, I found that to be really, kind of like I talked about in my talk, I found that to be frustrating, sad, maybe depressing, scary a little bit. But to really embrace that has caused me to focus on the present so much more than I ever did. Like I said in the talk, I hold my kids a little tighter. I cherish every moment so much more than I used to, because I just don't know how many of these moments I'm going to have. Everything is so finite. And so it gives me a sense of urgency for the here and now, both in appreciating the good things and confronting the sort of negative things about the human experience. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I know you could see, but totally nodding my head as you were just saying all of that. Yes.
Yeah.
So there was a good so we had a couple of questions just as far as you were involved in music, Christian music. So are you doing stuff creative now? Are you doing secular music? Is that still in your life?
I haven't written a song in 3.5 years. I remember where I was when I walked out of my last songwriting session for the last song on the last Hawk Nelson album. I remember it was October 2017. And I remember I like explicitly remember walking out of that studio and being like, I think that's it. Like, I think I'm done. Because at that point I knew I was going to be moving on from the band. I hadn't really fully started this sort of deep sort of faith deconstruction yet, although I had a lot of questions. But I haven't really done anything with music since then. I think for me, Christianity and music were very, very linked for a long time. And so like, I even had this experience where like I was at a friend's house, maybe a year and a half ago. It was pre-COVID. So, at least a year and a half ago. And they were like, hey, John, can you sit down on the piano and play something? And I was like, no, please don't ask me to do that. Like, it actually like really kind of triggered me almost. And I was like, oh, I had a serious visceral reaction to like, I do not want to play music right now. And that was really interesting. But yeah, I'm starting to sense that come down. Like I've sat down, we have a piano at the house. I've sat down on it and played music for my kids a few times since then. So I may explore music again at some point, but I think I needed a serious break, and I'm still in it. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's totally, it's completely understandable. And I even just your sharing, I mean, that music and religion at a very young age were integrally linked.
Yeah.
And then, but that was also your profession, your livelihood. And again, I would say, seeing the news about you, I was like, okay, this is interesting. And reading a little bit of the stories that were out about, the time when you were sort of, the experience that you went through.
Yeah.
But I had never heard of the band. And that's okay. That's not my genre. And so listening to music, I will say, very enjoyable, and some good pop music. I get why people liked it, but wow, it was full on, Jesus, religion.
Yeah.
Embedded in everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and like at the beginning of the band, it was definitely, there was this very sort of like vague positive thing going on, because that was like in Christian music at the time, like the early 2000s, that was sort of what was in the sort of space. But as time went on, I think it became more and more important for Christian music to be very explicit. And I picked up on that. And so I was definitely writing a lot of music that was very, very explicit about faith. And it's funny, I get asked about that a lot, because people are like, how could you have meant that so deeply and then now don't believe it anymore? And to that, I would just say it's the power of influence. Like, it's like, I grew up in it. It was the way that I saw the world. It was the language that I had. It was my whole way of being was sort of wrapped up in this faith tradition that I grew up in. And so like, I never really consciously chose. Right. And so like, I think about that with my kids, actually. Like, I think about like, okay, how early can I give them agency? How light a touch can I have on my parenting, and going like, hey, my kids are going to know that they have parents that absolutely adore them, that are in their corner, and that we're going to, teach them how to treat other people. We're going to teach them how to think well of themselves. But as far as like their own views and the way they see the world, like I want to encourage them to, like you've talked about, to be curious, to ask questions, to learn as much. I mean, as much as they can. I saw this talk one time from Dan Dennett, and he said that he thinks that studying all world religions, all the major world religions, should be something that's mandatory in school, which I thought was a really interesting position for an atheist to take. And his point was like, if they learn about all the religions and don't emphasize any one of them as true or untrue, just say, hey, here's what these people believe. This is what these people believe. This is what these people believe. Getting that information into kids' hands when they're young puts them in a place where they're far less indoctrinated, and they're looking at the world as a much more holistic way. And I think that's a really interesting thing to do. So that's what I plan on doing with my kids. And then I want to give them agency to make up their own mind about the world.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was like, spark the curiosity in them, let them go. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what did it for me. And my parents, to their credit, as much as they're still very much evangelical Christians. Like they always encourage me to go and do my own learning and ask questions. And they, were so supportive and encouraging of me in that area. So I think that's very much to their credit.
Well, fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. It's a very personal story. So sharing you, it's really sharing you with us. And when I reached out to you, I said, still 80% of our students who are involved with the SSA came from religious families. Most of those are Christian families. And so seeing someone who is really embedded and has and is figuring out that journey as they are is, I think, really important. So one, having role models and having people out there who sort of are being open about that journey, I think helps other people in their journey as well. So want to thank you for doing that. And we're sort of hopeful this could be the first generation that is in the United States, the younger generation could be the first generation that's actually majority non-religious.
Right. And I'm seeing the data move in that direction. Yeah.
And very quickly.
Yeah. And the other thing that's wild to me and is from what I understand, some data that I saw recently, 1 in 6 people in the US between the ages of 18 and 24, I hope I'm getting those numbers right, 1 in 6 identifies as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, which is really interesting to me because that means that more and more people are going to I know it's like I keep coming back to this issue of the LGBTQ plus community and affirming them. I am a cisgender straight white dude, so that's not me. But these are people that I care about so deeply, and this issue really, really, really matters to me. And I know that just that number of people, 1 in 6, it's going to cause more and more people to have to confront this issue, and hopefully to be more and more affirming over time. Just because there will be no way of avoiding it, honestly. And so I'm excited to see as we go on that our society becoming a much more affirming and accepting place for all kinds of different kinds of people.
Yeah.
And I'm really encouraged by the direction we're headed in that way.
Well, good. Again, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. There's if you get a chance, there's lots of comments and people sort of thank you for your story. Lots of good messages sending your way as well.
Awesome.
So,
thank you guys. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well,
and
good.
if you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, feel free to hit me on Twitter, John Steingard, or Instagram, John Steingard. And I just love interacting with you all. So feel free to hit me up there.
Yeah. And you have a fairly active Twitter.
Yeah. It's funny. My Twitter account was dead for years. I wasn't using it. And then in the process of the pandemic and deconstruction and all that stuff, all of a sudden Twitter became very useful. So
Totally get it. Well, good. I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's. We have one more session for the end of our conference. And it's a broadcast. So go to our Facebook page, Twitter page, or YouTube page, and you can participate that. It's members of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus talking about Christian nationalism and the uprising on the Capitol on January 6th. So again, John, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll sign off. And
all right. Thanks so much, Kevin. Thank you.